Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Looks like we've got some pretty interesting stuff to dig into today.
Yeah, definitely.
It's all about managing change, and it seems like you're particularly interested in how it all plays out in these big industrial settings.
Right.
Lots of moving parts, lots of potential for things to, well, go wrong if you're not careful.
Exact.
So we're calling this deep dive management of change, or MOC for short.
Makes sense.
Now, the main source you've given us is this guidelines for the management of change for process safety from the Center for Chemical Process Safety.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And hey there. Want to share your thoughts on
Hello,
this?
this is Vaid again. I hope you remember me as I talked to you about the MOC yesterday. I read this main source, Management of Change, from the Center of Chemical Process Safety, and I want you to make this conversation a little bit interesting for listener. I hope it is useful for listener. Thank you.
Well, hello there. It's great to have you back again.
Yeah, it's good to hear you've been diving into the source material too.
And we totally want to make this interesting and useful for you. That's our goal.
Absolutely. It sounds like you're already thinking about how all of this MOC stuff applies to you.
I think what makes this so interesting is how these seemingly small changes can have these huge ripple effects.
Yeah, it's not just about filling out paperwork, it's understanding those connections.
So let's really unpack that today and see what we can all learn together.
Sounds good to me. Let's jump in.
Okay, so where were we? Oh, right. We were about to talk about why this MOC thing is so important.
Exactly. It's not just some
Oh, go for it.
Excuse me. Before you start the meaning and the definition of MOC, let's talk a little bit about the change. What do you mean by change in, let's say, in a large, complex industrial setting like a petrochemical company with more than 4,000 people working there? Thank you.
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of MOC.
Yeah, let's unpack this. So when we talk about change in a big place like that, it's not just about swapping out equipment.
Exactly. The source material actually defines change as any addition, modification, or substitution that's not like for like replacement.
Okay, so it's broader than just hardware.
Way broader. It includes process changes like altering the way things are done or even using a different chemical.
What about people and their roles?
Oh, absolutely. Organizational changes like changing the number of operators on a shift or shifting responsibilities, that counts too.
Even changing the maintenance contractor or going from a 5-day work week to a 7-day schedule.
Exactly. And it can include policy changes like the amount of overtime someone can work or changes to safety rules.
So it's not just a piece of equipment, it's any variable that might affect safety.
That's right. Anything that has the potential to introduce new risks or alter existing ones, even something like a new software system or a change to the company's internet.
So even things that seem subtle can have a big impact.
Precisely. The source talks about subtle, previously unrecognized sources of change as a major cause of incidents.
Okay, so it's about being aware of all of these potential sources of change and having a system in place to manage them. And that leads us to why MOC is so important.
Yes, it's easy to see this when you look at examples of what happens when MOC is ignored,
Right, the chemical industry has some stark reminders of that.
like the Flixboro disaster.
Yeah, a seemingly simple pipe change led to a huge explosion.
It really highlights how a small tweak can have unintended consequences.
Absolutely, and those consequences can be tragic.
It's not just about big accidents, though.
No, it's also about protecting workers and the environment in smaller ways too.
It's about product quality, efficiency, even a company's reputation.
All of those things are directly impacted by how well you manage change.
You also gave us.
Ah, yeah, uh-huh.
Regarding the mentioned types of changes, what is the main difference between replacement in kind, RIK, and change?
That's a really insightful question.
Yeah, let's unpack this. It's a key distinction.
So, the source material actually uses the term replacement in kind, or RIK.
Okay, so RAK versus just a regular change.
Exactly. A replacement in kind is when you replace something with an item that meets the original design specs.
So it's like a like for like swap.
Yes, either an identical replacement or an acceptable alternative that doesn't change the function or safety.
So if you swap a pump for an identical one, that's an RIK.
Exactly. But if you replace it with a pump that has different specs, that's considered a change.
Even if the new one is better.
Even then, the key is whether it matches the original design specifications.
So what about non-physical changes, like procedures or personnel?
That's where it gets a little more subtle. You need to look at the functional requirements.
So not just what it is, but what it does.
Precisely. If a new procedure does the same thing and doesn't impact safety, it can be an RIK.
But if it changes how something is done or shifts responsibilities, it's a change.
Exactly. The source material is clear that any change that does not meet the original specs or functional requirements is not a replacement in kind.
That makes sense. And it makes MOC more important to be aware of those subtle differences.
Right? It's all about understanding the potential impacts of any modification.
And if it's not an RIK, you need to go through the MOC review process.
Absolutely. So, with that distinction in mind, let's move on to why MOC is so important.
Yes, they're setting the baseline for worker and environmental protection.
And ISO 9000 emphasizes the importance of documented procedures, which also applies to MOC.
So it's like this layered approach to safety and quality.
Exactly, with all of these things working together to make MA essential.
Now, I think one question people often have is, how complicated does MA need to be?
Yeah, it's a great question. It can seem overwhelming.
It's not about creating a mountain of paperwork, right?
No, it's about finding that sweet spot.
A system that's thorough but also easy to understand and use.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance.
Oh, yeah. Go on.
I like the sweet spots meaning, and I want you to explain it for me because I am working on developing and designing a new MOC system in my company. And one of the key areas, one of the challenges, of course, is that we have separated management system like CMMS, TSR, technical service request, and HR system. How can you design and implement an MOC system that integrates all of this in a big company, in a large company, in a complex company like petrochemical plants? Can you talk a little bit and clarify it more? Thank you.
Okay, that's a fantastic question, and it's so relevant to what we're discussing.
Yeah, I love that you're actively working on your own MOC system.
So, when we talk about the sweet spot in MOC, it's about balancing thoroughness with practicality.
You don't want a system so complex that nobody uses it, right?
Precisely. The source materiality says a modest system that works is better than an elegant one that doesn't.
So it's not about perfection, it's about effectiveness.
And that means designing a system that people understand and can actually use every day.
Now, your point about integrating different management systems is spot on, especially in large, complex operations.
It's very common to have these disparate systems like CFMS for maintenance and HR for personnel.
And if they don't talk to each other, MOC is going to be a challenge.
Exactly. The source material emphasizes integrating MOC with other PSM elements and existing company practices.
So you need to connect the dots between these systems.
That means mapping out how changes in one area might trigger a need for MOC in another.
For example, a maintenance work order should trigger a check against the MOC system.
Yes, and a change in personnel should initiate a review for training needs and potential skill gaps.
So it's about making these connections and thinking about how changes in one system affect another.
Right. Now, as far as how you actually accomplish this integration, there are a few key things to think about.
Okay, let's unpack that.
First, start by understanding how information flows between your current systems.
So identify where the data lives, who manages it, and how they are related.
Then, find where you can create automated triggers or notifications between those systems.
That way, if someone submits a maintenance work order for a change, it automatically starts the MOC process.
Exactly. And you might also create a central request for change or RFC system as the single point.
Oh, back to our listener. What's up?
You said that the electronic solution or system is the better choice and can have a kind of more effective integration between these isolated systems. Am I right? Can you talk about the best practices in this area? Some big companies, world-class companies that use these systems, electronic MOC, I mean. Thank you.
That's a great observation, and yes, you're right on the money.
Absolutely. An electronic MOC system can really streamline integration, and we can definitely talk about best practices there.
The source material actually highlights the emergence of MOC software applications and web-based documentation as key trends.
What's fascinating is that electronic systems really do offer ways to create those automated links we were just discussing.
It's all about making sure that information flows smoothly between systems.
And these systems can also really improve efficiency and reduce errors.
So let's get into some of those best practices and real-world examples.
Absolutely. First off, a well-designed electronic system needs to be user-friendly.
Yes, if it's clunky or hard to navigate, no one will use it.
It needs to have a clear interface and be easy for all employees to access.
And it needs to be customizable to your specific needs.
Right, a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work.
You need the flexibility to adjust it to your company's processes,
Another best practice is to integrate it with your other systems as much as possible.
so it's not operating in a silo.
No, it should communicate with your CMMS, HR, and other relevant platforms.
And it should automate the notification and approval workflows.
Yes, so those requests are routed to the right people automatically and nothing gets missed.
You asked about some specific companies.
Yeah, while the source doesn't call out specific company names, we do know that many major players in the chemical and petrochemical industry use these kinds of systems.
They are almost essential for very large, complex organizations.
Companies like Dow, BASF, and DuPont have implemented electronic MOC systems from what I've seen.
It makes sense given their need to maintain safety and regulatory compliance across massive operations.
And it's not just about large companies, even smaller businesses can see a huge benefit from an electronic system.
Now, the system itself isn't a magic bullet.
That's so true. You need the right culture, training, and support, too.
And we're going to talk more about those human elements later in our discussion.
Yes, implementing the technology is just the first step. It is about getting people to use it correctly.
But, oh yeah.
Okay, with this explanation, first of all, thank you. And I want to know what are the key components of a well-designed MOC system in a petrochemical company?
Oh, you're very welcome. And that's a great question.
Yes, it's important to break down the core elements of a good MOC system.
And since you're designing your own, this will be super useful.
So let's dive into the key components that make a well-designed MOC system tick in a complex setting like a petrochemical plant.
First off, you've got to have a really clear definition of what constitutes a change.
And we talked about how that's not just about equipment, it's about any modification that deviates from the original design or procedures, including organizational and software changes.
Yeah, and it's so important that everyone understands this definition.
Absolutely. Consistency is key, so you need clear guidelines on when to initiate that MOC process.
Next up, you need to establish well-defined roles and responsibilities.
So everyone knows what they're responsible for and who can approve what.
You need a system for those who originate a request and those who review it.
That's critical, and it should be independent of the originator.
And you need a process for how those approvals are documented and communicated.
And a clear scope that defines which changes need to go through MOC.
Yes, and that scope should be tailored to the unique risks of that plant.
And it needs to be integrated with other existing procedures and systems.
So those work orders, R&D recommendations, should have a MOC lens.
Absolutely. And that integration should streamline the change management process.
That way, it doesn't feel like an extra step.
Exactly. Now, you also need a good hazard review process.
So that all changes go through a robust safety evaluation.
That process should really help identify potential risks and appropriate controls.
And that means not only checking for hazards, but verifying tasks have been performed.
Yes, and that leads to authorization review, and you have to make sure all tasks are completed.
Which is a check to ensure all hazards are dealt with before startup.
Then there's the issue of temporary changes.
Yeah, they need a specific protocol to track and manage.
And it needs to be clear on how long they can last and how to transition to a more permanent solution. Oh yeah, let's hear it.
Okay, mentioning the temporary changes, we know that we can categorize and classify the different changes in permanent, temporary, and emergency changes. Can you talk a little bit about these different types of changes and how can we design a workflow, of course, a different and unique workflow for each of them? Thank you.
Okay, that's a really important point you've brought up.
Yeah, let's dive into the different types of changes and how we manage them.
So you're right, changes are often categorized as permanent, temporary, and emergency.
And each one requires its own unique approach.
A permanent change, as the name suggests, is a long-term or indefinite modification.
Like when you install new equipment or change your standard operating procedure.
And these require the full MOC process to make sure they are implemented safely and effectively.
Which includes that in-depth hazard review, documentation, and training that we have discussed.
Exactly. Now, a temporary change is something that's implemented for a limited time.
Like using a temporary bypass line while you repair a valve.
And even though it's temporary, it still needs MOC review, just maybe a streamlined version.
So you're still looking at potential hazards, but with a faster turnaround time.
And you have to have a system for tracking temporary changes and ensuring they don't become permanent.
And how do you design a different workflow for those?
Well, for temporary changes, your workflow might involve an expedited review process.
So you have a quicker approval, but with a clear expiration date.
And you still need documentation, but it might be less detailed compared to a permanent change.
And you need to make sure affected personnel are trained on the temporary changes.
Yes, and then you need clear steps for what happens when that temporary change is over.
So it's all very intentional and tracked properly.
Now let's talk about emergency changes.
This is where you need to act very quickly to address an immediate safety concern.
Right, you can't always wait for the normal MOC review process.
So how do you handle that kind of situation?
Well, the first step is to quickly stabilize the situation, if possible.
So immediately reduce the risk or get people out of harm's way.
Then you need to make sure to initiate a review of that emergency change as soon as possible.
So it's not that you bypass MOC, but you're starting it after the immediate issue.
Exactly, and the workflow for emergency changes needs to account for that.
So it's a faster process with clear authorization and documentation, but it's done after the fact.
And it's essential to document what happened, why, and what was done to mitigate the risk.
This helps to learn from the emergency situation and prevent it from happening again.
So, in short, you have different workflows for different change categories.
Yeah, that makes sense. Each workflow is designed for each risk and situation.
It is about making sure that the process is appropriate for the change type.
And that brings us to communication and training.
Of course, all employees should be trained on MOC and its importance.
And there should be a system to communicate those changes to anyone affected.
So, to sum it all up, we're talking clear definitions, roles, and scopes.
A robust hazard review process and documented approvals.
Integration with other systems and special processes for temporary and emergency changes.
Plus ongoing training and communication for everyone involved.
So hopefully that helps provide you with some solid building blocks.
Yeah, now with those key areas covered, let's discuss why it's all so important.
Yep, go on.
Excuse me, another question talking about the clear roles and responsibility. Of course, we know we have some people, we call them originator of the change, some of them the initiator of the change, initial reviewer, of course the coordinator, and administrator and authorizers. Can you talk a little bit about these different terminologies in a management of change system, especially in petrochemical, oil and gas industries? Thank you.
Okay, that's a fantastic question. And it's great you're thinking about all these different roles.
Yeah, understanding the terminology is key to designing an effective MOC system. Let's break those down.
So when we talk about the originator or initiator of a change, that's the person who first identifies the need for a change.
Exactly. This is the person who starts the process, usually by submitting a request for change.
And this could be anyone from an operator to an engineer or even someone in management.
Then you have the initial reviewer.
And that's someone who does a preliminary check on change request.
They determine if it's worth pursuing and whether it's a change or a replacement in kind, as we discussed earlier.
So they are making sure the change is within the scope of the MOC system.
And also that all the necessary information is included before moving along.
Now you mentioned, oh yeah, let's hear it.
Excuse me, I want to make clear this. In a large complex company like petrochemical with more than 4,000 people working there, of course it is not possible to have a kind of MO system that can give the initiation permission to all of the workers. So we have to differentiate.
Oh, absolutely. That's a really insightful point you made there.
Yeah, it's definitely not realistic to give every single employee the ability to initiate any change they want willy-nilly.
That would be total chaos, right?
Exactly. The system needs to be structured with some controls and a process to filter those requests.
So it is all about striking that right balance between accessibility and accountable.
Right, and the source material suggests this should be a just fit-for-duty system. Okay, that's a really important point you're bringing up.
Yeah, it's about figuring out who can initiate changes and how to manage that in a big place.
You are absolutely right. It's not practical for every single employee to have the ability to just start the MOC process.
In fact, that could easily create chaos if the system wasn't properly controlled.
So, in large organizations, you usually have a more defined process for initiating change.
There might be specific roles or departments that have the authorization to submit change requests. So let's clarify a bit about roles, keeping in mind what you've brought up.
Okay, so we were discussing the different roles in an MOC system.
And you brought up those originators or initiators, the ones who first identify a need for change.
Yes, and they submit that initial request.
Now, as you pointed out, it's not practical for every single worker to be an initiator.
No, some employees might have more authorization to submit requests depending on their role and training. This could include engineers, supervisors, maintenance personnel, and certain qualified operators.
But it really depends on the company and its specific needs.
The source material mentions the importance of having a clear scope for your MOC system, and that applies here too.
So you need to figure out which roles and departments are most likely to identify the need for a change.
And then you need to make sure those individuals are properly trained on the MOC system.
And you also have to provide a way for anyone to suggest changes, even if they can't initiate the request directly. And that's where the initial reviewer comes in to filter and check those requests.
They determine if it's within scope and worth pursuing before it moves forward.
And after the initial review, the request is to the MOC coordinator.
Right, and the coordinator is that person who manages the whole process.
They are the hub of all the MOC activities, making sure the process works smoothly.
They also might be responsible for training and communication about MOC. Yes, that could be through a supervisor or a designated contact.
Now let's get back to the rest of the terminology you asked about.
After the initial review, the request goes to the ACO-C coordinator.
Yeah, and this person is responsible for managing the MOC process and usually oversees the system itself.
They often act as a point of contact for questions and monitor progress of requests.
Then you have the administrator, who could be the same person as the coordinator or someone else. And that could be on a facility or sometimes a company-wide level.
You also mentioned administrators.
Yes, these are the people who maintain the MOC system and its records.
They may be in charge of inputting data, running reports, or managing access to the system.
So basically keeping the nuts and bolts of MOC running smoothly.
Now, finally, you mentioned authorizers. And this individual often focuses on the documentation and record keeping.
They make sure that all the paperwork is completed correctly.
And then you have the authorizers of the change.
These are usually senior personnel or managers who approve the change before it's implemented.
They're making sure that all safety measures have been addressed and it's good to go.
So all these different roles provide checks and balances. And these are the people who have the authority to approve a change.
That approval may be needed at different points in the process.
After the hazard review or after training or to start the change or to close it out.
And these authorizations are really key to ensuring that the appropriate reviews are done before a change is implemented.
So there are a lot of different moving parts and people with specific functions.
And all of these people work together to ensure changes are well managed. Yes, and they're essential for making sure that the MOC process is thorough and complete.
And with that said, we should make sure we talk about why all of this matters so much.
Absolutely. MOC isn't just a bureaucratic exercise.
It's about protecting people, the environment, and your company's bottom line.
We've touched on this, but it really is about avoiding the serious incidents and disasters that can occur.
And those have significant financial implications for a company. And it's important that the people who take on these roles are well trained.
And that these roles are clearly, hey, yeah, what's up?
Talking about the bureaucracy and some complicated workflows and other maybe responsibility or something that is a kind of obstacle. I want
Oh,
you-
okay. I think I understand what you're getting at.
Yeah, it
Explain
sounds
it.
like you're wondering about the human side of things.
You know, the source talks about the commitment required for effective MOC systems,
So it's not just about having the right forms and procedures.
right? It's about the people who are involved and the culture around them.
And it sounds like you're interested in the different job roles.
all those different people in charge of the change.
Well, we just went over some of those different roles, like originator and authorizer.
But it's important to see how all of those people interact with one another.
Yeah, and each of them have their own responsibilities in the MOC process.
And that means their training, their experience, and even their personalities.
All of that has an impact on how they approach MOC and their workflows.
So let's talk a bit about those complicated workflows you mentioned.
Well, we already talked about the different flows for permanent, temporary, and emergency changes.
But it's also important to consider the people who are involved in each step.
You know, the source talks about the importance of a just fit for duty system.
So it has to be practical and work for all those people involved.
And that is why the system needs to be easy to understand and use.
And people must also see how MOC contributes to the bigger picture.
So it's not just a bunch of rules, but something that keeps everyone safe.
So it's really more than just the table work and the processes.
It's also about the people and their stories and experience. Oh, yeah, uh-huh.
And what is the role of process safety specialist or engineer in the whole system, MOC system? Thank you.
Oh, that's a really insightful question.
Yeah, it's key to understand the role of process safety in MOC, and especially process safety engineers.
So let's unpack that and see how they fit into the whole picture.
Well, process safety is really about preventing accidents and incidents.
So it's at the heart of why we need MOC in the first place.
And the process safety engineer is a specialist in this field.
So they're the ones with the technical expertise.
Right, they have the knowledge of things like hazard analysis, risk assessment, and safety regulations.
So how does that translate to their specific role in the MOC system?
Well, a process safety engineer often plays a key role in hazard reviews.
So they're the ones that look for potential dangers with any proposed change.
Yeah, they identify hazards, assess their risks, and recommend ways to mitigate them.
And they make sure that the change is aligned with all safety procedures
They also help develop and implement MOC procedures for the company.
so that the system is working effectively and efficiently.
And they can also provide specialized training to other staff members.
So it's their expertise that helps everyone better understand MOC.
Process safety engineers also play a vital role in auditing the MOC system.
So they're checking to make sure everything is working as it should be.
And if they see gaps, they will recommend ways to improve the process.
So they are an essential part of the team that keeps everyone safe.
And they are essential in large, complex facilities with significant hazards.
Now, in small companies, you may not always have a dedicated process safety engineer.
Yes, and that role might be filled by an engineer with additional training.
So it really depends on the specific company and the level of risk.
The source material does mention that MOC needs to be fit for purpose.
And that means having the right people with the right expertise on the job.
So a process safety engineer's job is ensuring safety is at the core of MOC.
And with that in mind, let's get back to why MOC is so important.
And things like product quality,
Thank you.
efficiency, and even a company's reputation.
Yeah, you also give us some background on things like responsible care, OSHA, and ISO 9000.
Yeah, it's really important to understand how all those initiatives to relate to MOC.
So how do these different initiatives and regulations shape your approach to change management?
Well, responsible care encourages companies to go beyond the minimum.
So it's not about checking boxes, it's about continuous improvement.
Not to mention the impact on a company's reputation and community relations.
So it's more than compliance. It's a commitment to safety and responsible operations.
And a lot of this is about culture.
Yes, that plays a huge role in making the MOC system work in a company.
The system needs to be backed up by a culture that prioritizes safety and open communication.
It should be one where people feel comfortable reporting potential risks.
Exactly. And then OSHA and the EPA set those baseline mandatory standards.
So that's the baseline for worker and environmental protection.
And ISO 9000 emphasizes the importance of documented procedures, which applies to MOC.
So it's all these layered approaches to quality and safety.
Now, I think one of the questions people have is, how complicated does MOC need to be?
It's a great question. It can seem overwhelming to people.
And that includes not being afraid to speak up if they see something unsafe. Because in the end, MOC isn't just a process, it's a collective effort.
It requires that everyone from the top management to the frontline workers does their part.
Exactly. And that's where training becomes so essential.
Every employee needs to be properly trained on the MOC procedures.
And not just when they start, it needs to be ongoing and refreshed.
But it's not about making more paperwork, right?
No, it's about finding that balance between thoroughness and ease of use.
So the system is actually effective and can easily be used daily.
We call that the sweet spot. A system that works is better than an elegant one that doesn't.
Yes, and that's especially true of complex places like petrochemical plants.
Right, and a system that doesn't take into account people and their needs will ultimately fail.
And it has to be specific to their job so they know how MOC applies to them.
This also includes contractors and other non-company personnel.
Now, with all this information you've provided today, what are some other areas that you think are essential?
Well, there is how you actually go about implementing an MOC system.
Right, we've talked a lot about the theory, but the execution is key.
You need a plan and a way to roll out the new system.
It needs to be done in a way that doesn't disrupt operations or create confusion.
And you have to allow for the fact that it's not going to be perfect the first time.
Absolutely. You have to continuously review and make adjustments.
It is about embracing that idea of constant improvement
And that brings us to auditing the system.
because it's not enough to just put it in place.
Now, it's not just about equipment, it's about the processes and the people.
And even things like shift schedules that can impact worker fatigue.
Exactly. And you need a way for people to give feedback on the MOC process.
It is a constant cycle of improvement, not a one-time fix.
So we know why MOC is important, but what does it look like in practice?
Well, the source emphasizes defining all the roles and responsibilities.
You need a way to check that the MOC system is actually working as intended,
That means tracking metrics, looking at areas for improvement.
and also ensuring that you are catching those small problems before they become major issues.
And that also goes for the documentation and ensuring that
Okay, I have a suggestion here. We talk about the MOC system, the fundamentals, the terminologies, and different types of changes, and some key components of an effective MOC system. Because I want to continue this discussion with you guys, I suggest that wrap it up here and continue our discussion in next sessions. What do you think? Thank you.
That's a great suggestion, and we're totally on board with that.
yeah, it's a good way to make sure we're covering everything you're most interested in.
So let's do a quick recap of the fundamentals and then save some deeper dives for the next session.
Absolutely. It'll help solidify everything we've covered so far.
Okay, so we
Thank
started
you.
with a basic concept of MOC, management of change.
And we emphasize that it's not just a corporate term, but an essential safety practice.
It's about making sure changes in a process do not introduce risk.
We talked about how MOC is important to protect people, the environment, and your company.
And we said it's about those long-term wins for a company too.
Then we went over the definition of change and we talked about replacement in kind.
Right, it's not just about swapping out a piece of equipment.
It's about modifications to procedures, software, personnel, and so on.
And we pointed out that even subtle changes can have big consequences.
We then discussed those key MOC terminologies and different roles.
Yeah, like the originator, reviewer, coordinator, authorizer, and so on.
And we clarified that not everyone can initiate a change in a large facility,
We also talked about those different types of changes: permanent, temporary, and emergency.
each with its own specific approach and workflow and documentation.
And you wanted to know about the key components of an effective system,
Yes, and that includes things like clear definitions, roles, scopes,
plus a robust hazard review process, documented approvals, and integration with other systems.
and special processes for temporary changes, emergency changes, and ongoing training.
And also the importance of communication to everyone who is involved.
And we talked about how those key steps help create a successful MOC.
So I think that's a solid recap of what we've covered so far.
Yes, and that sets the stage for our next discussion.
And, we did touch on this in a previous discussion, so I'll just quickly skim over it here. But it's really important to remember that MOC isn't just about stopping change.
No, it's about making sure change is done safely and effectively.
And we can delve much deeper into that in the next session.
Now, you asked about the documentation, and that's also critical.
You need records of what was proposed, who reviewed it, and all those concerns.
And that documentation is necessary for accountability and future decisions,
And then you had a great question about training and how that all works.
which is an ongoing process, not just a one-time event. We'll talk more about that.
And communication is another key piece of the puzzle to ensure everyone is on the same page.
Yeah, transparency is essential to success, and we'll get deeper into that next time.
And then we talked
Thank
about
you.
temporary changes and those quick fixes.
We'll explain how those can be very tricky to manage if not carefully controlled.
We also mentioned that you need a clear plan for emergency situations too.
And that includes figuring out how to review those changes after the fact.
And that leads us to the human side of MOC and getting everyone on board
It's about getting buy-in from people to embrace the system.
and making it part of their everyday culture and how they work.
We will also discuss how to monitor the system and continuously improve.
And we talked about needing a dedicated coordinator to own the process.
And of course, the all-important leadership commitment and a culture of safety.
Okay, so with that said, I think we've covered a lot of the ground with MOC today.
Yes, and I
Yes,
hope
of
that's all
course, you
been
covered.
helpful and
And
informative
thank you
for
for your nice
And we've given you a good
explanation.
overview of this complex but essential area of process safety.
So thanks for joining us today. It's been great having you with us.
Yes, and thanks so much for all of your great questions and insights.
We really
Thank you
appreciate
for
you
you-
being part of this learning experience.
We're looking forward to the next time we get to talk with you.
And
course,
we will be
sure.
sure to pick up where we're leaving off today.
Until next time, stay curious and keep learning about the MOC all around you.
And please do join us again for our next deep dive on the
Sure.
human side of MOC.
Thank you. Bye bye.